Hi there, I'm Brendon Lynch, Chief Privacy Officer at Airbnb, and I'm here today to talk to you on Data Privacy Day about how privacy can be a key enabler of diversity and inclusion initiatives. But first, let me thank the National Cybersecurity Alliance and LinkedIn for once again being hosts of Data Privacy Day here in the US, and I'm delighted to be a part of the program. So what I'm essentially going to be taking you through is a case study of how privacy was this enabler for a key project we have at Airbnb called Project Lighthouse, which is about inclusion on the Airbnb platform. But first, let me just give you a little bit of background on Airbnb with some key facts. Airbnb, as you know, is a platform where hosts and guests get connected for stays and for experiences, be that a private home or a spare room in a home or an online experience or an in-person experience. And to date, we have 5.6 million active listings around the world, and that's represented across 100,000 cities. And to date, we've had guest arrivals of over 800 million worldwide. And a few fun facts on the types of listings we have. You'll see a range of things here. Tiny homes, we have 24,000. We have a lot of boats and castles and yurts. Tree houses are very popular. Even private islands and igloos you'll find on Airbnb. But more than a place to stay or experience to have on a trip, Airbnb is really a community, and it's a community that's based on connection and belonging. That's one of the key things that differentiates Airbnb from other ways of travel and other ways of staying in places. And Airbnb was founded on trust. You know, many at the time thought it was crazy to start a business based on the concept of inviting a stranger into your home. And so the founders, really looked at trust as a core design problem and design challenge and built for that. And initially it was things like the profile pages, the two-way messaging, the secure payments, the reviews in both directions of the guest and the host that helped to build that trust, and then many other features and attributes over time. And privacy, by the way, is a key enabler of trust as well. And so the privacy strategy is very much built around trust and belonging also. The mission overall is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere. And so inherently in this mission is the concept of inclusion and embracing diversity. So it's probably no surprise that we would have a project that's focused around that specifically. Another way of framing this is that everyone has an equitable access to amazing trips. And unfortunately, it doesn't always work out the way we would intend. In 2016, there was a study published which showed that there was evidence of systemic racism occurring in parts of the Airbnb platform. And that's where the anti-discrimination team really was born and worked on a range of initiatives to help intervene in that type of behavior. So addressing discrimination on Airbnb on an ongoing basis is actually essential. It's very core to the mission of the company. So where to start? Well, first of all, we wanted to look at racial discrimination here in the US. And to address it, we needed to understand two things. First of all, what was easier for us to understand was where we had these self-reported cases that come through our community support where an individual has complained of somebody, some sort of racial discrimination. And those can be investigated and dealt with in an individual basis. But what we're also interested in is understanding whether there's systemic patterns at play. And these are the unreported issues. And how would we know what these are? And how would we measure discrimination on a systemic basis? That is the core challenge here. So we went about creating a process to help us measure and understand these patterns at the systemic level. And that's what is called Project Lighthouse. It's about finding and fighting discrimination on Airbnb. at its core, it's the measurement system for discrimination on Airbnb. And privacy, as you might imagine, is a really important part of that equation. So how do we go about it? Well, since people often discriminate based on the race or ethnicity they perceive someone to be, we needed a way to measure this perception. So that was the starting point, and its impacts at scale across the platform. So we're able to do this by using information that our community has already shared publicly. That's their first name and their profile photo, which is a part of the public Airbnb profile. So we're able to leverage that. The measurement can help us understand if different groups have different experiences on Airbnb based on their perceived race, which means that we can create product interventions to address those experience gaps and then to be able to measure their effectiveness. So without this measurement system, we wouldn't be able to necessarily understand what mitigations were being effective at thwarting discrimination on the platform. So that's where Lighthouse comes in. From a data science standpoint, the initial goal here is to measure what's called the acceptance rate gap. So when a potential guest is making reservations or trying to make reservations, what's the rate at which they get accepted versus what they get rejected? And does that differ across different racial groups? So this data here is an illustration just to show you, but this is really what the focus is about. First of all, can we establish a baseline? If we have perceived race data and we're able to combine that with acceptance rates, can we therefore look for differences among different racial groups? And once we have that, can we then run experiments or implement interventions and see how effective those are in practice, again, by measuring at a different point in time to see if that acceptance rate gap has shrunk. In this case, it's indicating that it has shrunk, but there's still more work to do, as an example. So from a privacy standpoint, the goal is to really prevent the targeting of users based on perceived race. So we recognize that perceived race is a sensitive attribute. And we want to protect against that both from unauthorized or authorized access to data. And so what that really means in practice is that we had a goal of ensuring that the perceived race data was not stored with the Airbnb profile and not linked to an Airbnb profile. The technique we used for that is called P-sensitive K anonymity. And I know that's quite a mouthful. I'm going to try and demystify this for those that are not aware of its intricacies. And I'm going to illustrate it with an example that's related to Project Lighthouse. So I'm just going to use a very small table. Obviously, in practice, we'd use a much larger data set, but let's assume that we're going to use the data from 5 users. In this case, you'll see the first column is the number of accepted reservations. The second column is the number of rejected reservations. And the third column is the perceived race of the individual. Now, I'll explain later how we get this data in a combination. But what are the risks, the disclosure risks that we're actually seeking to mitigate here? Well, let's assume that we know that Adam is in the data set, someone called Adam. And so it's a membership disclosure, which we've assumed. And let's say we also know that Adam was accepted twice and rejected once, because we just have knowledge. Adam's told us perhaps that he's been rejected once, but stayed twice in Airbnbs. So that's background knowledge. Well, that might be enough actually to disclose the identity of the individual and the sensitive data. So let's see. If you look at the table, you can see the third row has 2 accepts and 1 reject. So therefore, we know that row 3 is data about Adam, and we call that an identity disclosure. We've identified that row 3 is Adam's data. We also know, because of row 3, that Adam's perceived race is Black. So that's what we call a sensitive attribute disclosure as well. So those are the two risks that we're seeking to mitigate with Project Lighthouse from a privacy standpoint: the identity disclosure problem and the sensitive attribute disclosure problem. And that's where P-sensitive K-anonymity comes in. So how would we go about altering this data set so that those disclosures were not possible? Well, first of all, we K-anonymize the data. And what that does is ensures that there's not a unique row of a combination of numbers. Of the 2 and the 1 in this case is unique, and that was what enabled us to identify. What you can do, and what K-anonymity can do, is bundle that in. And so what it adds a little bit of noise. In this case, it's saying that it's either 2 accepts or 3 accepts, or if you take it a step further, it sort of averages those out, and this is called micro aggregation. So now you can see we've got 3 overall. The total number of accepts is still the same if you were to total that whole column, but you wouldn't be able to uniquely identify the individual within it based on the accept and reject pair. So we've got rid of that identity disclosure risk. But we still have the sensitive attribute disclosure, because you'll notice that all 3 of these rows have the same perceived race, in this case of black. So what we need to do then is apply the P-sensitization process, which alters the attribute, and it will alter one of them to be white, so that there is not a way to identify the sensitive attribute in this case. So that's how this all works. And so that data set now it's impossible to figure out which row is Adam, and therefore additionally, it's impossible for us to know what Adam's race is just based on the data. So if I come back to the original data set with those things listed, the first thing we did was K-anonymize the data, and that the result there was, instead of row 3 being about Adam, we know that it's one of row 3, 4, or 5. So we've eliminated that identity disclosure risk. But the sensitive attribute disclosure is still there. But once we P-sensitize the data as well, we now do not know what the perceived race of Adam is, and therefore we've eliminated that risk also. So what about applying this at the systematic level? How do we actually run these experiments? This is how it works. I'm going to show you, I'm not going to take you through each node of this, but I do want to sort of explain some of the where some of these key processes fit in this. But one of the things that's important to note is that there are some organizational boundaries here. A part of this approach, which is crucial to the approach, around the linkability of the data back to the Airbnb profile, is to use a third-party researcher as a part of this. So you'll see an Airbnb boundary, which is this large dotted shape on the left, and then you'll see the research partner trust boundary on the right. So let me take you through some of the key parts of this process where we see the data being processed. So at the beginning, we're starting with the guest data. We've got the acceptance rates and the rejection rates. We've got user IDs. We're separating it into 2 pathways. So down the bottom here of this first section, we've got a user ID, and we've got the number of accept and the number of rejected bookings. On the upper pathway, we're preparing data ready for the research partner to assign the perceived race. So what we've got here is the user ID. We've got the first name and the profile photograph of the individual. It goes through, first of all, this K-anonymous process. And what that does is a couple of things. It creates a temporary randomized identifier for the user. And it stores that against, on the inside Airbnb, it stores that against the accept and reject data. So we've got that table sitting there. Then meanwhile, the first name and profile data, along with the now new identifier, gets passed across to the research partner. They will decrypt it. they will have a human look at the first name and the photograph and assign a perceived race to it. And that is what gets sent back to Airbnb along with that temporary identifier. So now we've got the ability to combine these two data sets, which is what we do, at the same time as p-sensitizing the data to make sure that the sensitive attribute disclosure risk is taken care of. And so what we're left with is a data set that there's no unique identifiers with this anymore, just the accept and reject data along with the perceived race. And we're able to use that to, in this case, calculate the acceptance rate gap. So that's how it works. There's obviously encryption involved as we pass the data between the parties in addition. And there's also the way that we run this is a batch process. So we'll do an experiment at a point of time. We'll take a large set of data, we'll put it through this process, we'll calculate the acceptance rate gap. And then we can actually drop the data too. We don't need that to keep that for a long period of time. So that's one of the privacy attributes of this process. Then we'll implement some changes, and then later on, we can come back and run another experiment to recalculate the acceptance rate gap and see whether we move the dial or not. So I've mentioned encryption, I've mentioned data retention as two of the privacy attributes. There are a few other attributes of this project. First of all, this began quite some time ago, and the anti-discrimination team partnered with a lot of external organizations. There was a lot of consultation with civil rights groups like Color of Change, NAACP, a number of privacy groups and privacy academics on the techniques. Privacy groups like Center for Democracy and Technology were involved. So that's an important part of this project, was getting that external input. As I mentioned before, the perceived race data not linked to an Airbnb account is a key attribute for this. But we also wanted to provide transparency and control. And we did that through, first of all, email notifications. So we sent emails to the user base 60 days before we started the project, 30 days before. Also in-app notifications, and in those communications we gave people the opportunity to opt out, so we gave that control, and I'm happy to report that we got a very low opt-out rate from this. People were presumably trust this process given all the effort that we put into it. So that in a nutshell is the project, and I think the general point here in a broader sense is that privacy, diversity, inclusion, and equity are really crucial topics these days. And we, of course, in the privacy community all know that privacy is a crucial topic. And I wanted to highlight an example of how privacy can be a key enabler of diversity and inclusion initiatives with this example. If you'd like to find out more information, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can go to this page on our website, airbnb.com/against-discrimination, where you will find a lot more details about the program and FAQs, and a link to this very detailed technical paper, which describes the architecture in a much more substantive way than I have here. We very much wanted to share this with the world for two reasons. One is to get feedback and input. We will look to continue to improve this, and also to provide this as an example if others wanted to emulate this in some way, if they thought that this was potentially applicable to a scenario they had within their organization. So with that, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your data privacy day. Thank you.